I am Caroline, 33 years old, and somehow still paying for the delusion of my family. As the secret founder of a Wall Street private equity firm, I built an empire in the shadows, while my parents treated me like a financial burden. Last night at my sister's lavish rehearsal dinner, she dragged me over to her billionaire future father-in-law. She smirked, pointing at me, and announced to the room that I was the family failure. I simply held my glass of water and maintained eye contact with the billionaire. That was the exact moment the color drained from his face because he recognized me as the ruthless executive who had just bought his company's massive defaulted debt. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in our suburban New York neighborhood meant pretending we had money we never actually possessed. Inside our home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. My childhood was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet, mostly because my parents reserved all their affection and financial resources for my younger sister. I maintained straight grades and earned scholarships, but nothing I did ever mattered compared to her sheer existence. The crystal chandeliers of the Oakbridge Country Club cast a sharp, unforgiving light on the rehearsal dinner. I stood near the edge of the grand ballroom, nursing a glass of sparkling water, watching my family perform their absolute favorite routine of aggressive social climbing. My mother, Brenda, hissed at me to stop standing in the shadows like a depressed bat. Her fingers, weighed down by a tennis bracelet my father could not actually afford, dug painfully into my forearm. She told me Jamal's father, Winston, had just arrived. She demanded I try to look like I belonged to this family, or at least try not to look like a bankrupt accountant for 5 minutes. Before I could politely remove her hand, my 29-year-old sister Brittany materialized in a flurry of white silk and pure entitlement. Brittany was the golden child, a social media influencer whose entire lifestyle was subsidized by our parents' dwindling retirement fund. Tonight, she was practically glowing with the triumph of securing Jamal the chief operating officer of Vanguard Properties. Jamal was a wealthy African-American executive whose family owned half the commercial real estate in the city. Brittany grabbed my arm and commanded me to come with her. She said Winston wanted to meet the whole family. She explicitly ordered me not to talk about my boring spreadsheet job and told me to just smile and nod. She dragged me across the marble floor, cutting through the crowd of wealthy, well-dressed guests. At the center of the room stood Jamal, tall and impeccably groomed, wearing a smirk that seemed permanently etched into his features. Beside him stood his father, Winston. Winston was a legend in the commercial real estate sector. He was a ruthless 65-year-old titan who built Vanguard Properties into an $800 million empire. He held a glass of aged scotch, looking utterly bored by the sycophants surrounding him. Brittany chirped, her voice pitching up into a sickly sweet register. She introduced me to Winston and Jamal as her older sister. She stepped aside, exposing me to the billionaire's gaze. Then she smiled brightly and declared that I was the family failure. Jamal let out a loud, booming laugh that carried over the string quartet playing in the corner. He told Brittany not to be so harsh because they needed people to do their taxes. He leaned in his cologne, suffocatingly heavy, and warned me not to pocket any of the silverware tonight because the club charged his family for missing inventory. My father, Richard, rushed over to join the circle, chuckling nervously. He desperately tried to align himself with the wealthy groom. He told Winston they did not brag about me because I lacked the entrepreneurial drive that Brittany had. He told the billionaire I crunched numbers in a cubicle somewhere and labeled me the black sheep of the flock. I did not react. I did not flush with embarrassment, nor did I look down at my modest black dress. I simply maintained eye contact with Winston. I watched as the boredom vanished from the billionaire's face, replaced by a sudden violent tension. His eyes widened, darting from my face to the discreet silver lapel pin on my blazer. The blood drained from his cheeks so rapidly he looked as though he might collapse. The glass of scotch in his hand trembled, the amber liquid sloshing over the crystal rim and dripping onto his expensive Italian loafers. His voice was entirely devoid of its former booming authority when he finally spoke. He cleared his throat, sounding suddenly fragile, and whispered that it was me. He stammered that this was unexpected. Brenda smiled obliviously and waved her hand. She told Winston not to worry because I would not be in any of the main wedding photos. She proudly announced they were seating me near the back tomorrow, so I would not ruin the aesthetic. Winston took a half step backward. He was not looking at Brenda. He was staring directly into my eyes with the unmistakable look of a man who had just stepped on a landmine. He whispered my professional name, Caroline J. I kept my tone perfectly conversational. I told him I was just Caroline tonight and that I was simply here to celebrate my sister and leave my work at the office. Jamal frowned, sensing the bizarre shift in his father's demeanor. He told his dad not to waste his breath on a low-level auditor. Winston looked at his son like Jamal had just signed his own death warrant. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form a word, a club manager in a crisp suit approached our circle, holding a leather-bound folio. The manager cleared his throat and addressed my parents. He announced that the florist was refusing to release the centerpieces for tomorrow's reception until the outstanding balance of $15,000 was settled. He stated clearly that the card on file had been declined. The air in our circle grew thick with immediate humiliation. Brenda's manicured hands flew to her pearl necklace, her face flushing a deep, blotchy crimson. Richard stammered frantically, patting the pockets of his tuxedo jacket as if a spare $15,000 might magically appear in the lining. Brittany shrieked, her influencer facade cracking instantly. She whipped her head toward Jamal and demanded to know why Vanguard was not covering the floral arrangements. She complained about the imported orchids he had promised her. Jamal crossed his arms, his jaw tightening defensively. He stated that his family was covering the $2 million venue and the catering. He insisted the flowers were my parents' responsibility. He claimed Vanguard's cash flow was tied up in a massive commercial acquisition right now, and he could not authorize a petty cash drop for flowers. Brenda turned on me, her eyes wild with panic and misplaced rage. It was the classic dynamic of our household. Whenever they overextended themselves trying to look rich, I was expected to act as the financial safety net, only to be tossed aside the moment the crisis was averted. Brenda snapped her fingers at me like I was a disobedient dog and ordered me to pay the man. I looked at her, my expression deliberately blank. I asked if she really wanted me to pay $15,000 for orchids after she just allowed them to call me a failure who crunches numbers in a cubicle. Richard stepped into my personal space, his face red with suppressed rage. He hissed at me not to get smart. He reminded me they fed me, clothed me, and let me live in the basement for 2 years while I went to community college. He told me I owed this family. He demanded I empty out whatever pathetic savings account I had and pay the bill, swearing that I would be dead to them if I refused. Jamal chuckled, a cruel, mocking sound. He told Richard not to press the girl. He joked that if I drained my checking account, I might have to walk home. He smugly offered to have his assistant wire the money tomorrow, claiming it was pocket change for him anyway. Winston interrupted abruptly. His voice cracked. The billionaire was sweating profusely now, a sheen of moisture gathering on his forehead. He barked at Jamal to shut up. Jamal blinked, stunned by his father's sharp tone, and tried to defend himself. Winston raised his voice louder, his hands visibly shaking, and ordered his son to be quiet immediately. Ignoring the groom's confusion, I calmly reached into my clutch. I bypassed my standard debit card and pulled out a heavy, matte black metal card. It had no numbers on the front, only an embedded microchip and a sleek laser-engraved logo. The logo was a geometric wolf head, the unmistakable insignia of Apex Paradigm. I handed it to the club manager and instructed him to run it. I also told him to put an extra $5,000 on it as a tip for the staff dealing with the floral delay. The manager took the heavy metal card, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized the elite tier of the account. He bowed slightly and hurried away. Brittany rolled her eyes, crossing her arms over her chest. She complained that I was going to hold this over their heads for the rest of the year. She accused me of maxing out 6 different credit cards to pull that off, and told me to stop acting like a high roller because it was pathetic. Brenda smoothed her dress instantly, regaining her haughty composure now that the bill was handled. She told me not to expect them to pay me back anytime soon. She said I should consider it my contribution to the family. She added that since I had no husband and no real life of my own, I should be grateful they even let me participate in Brittany's big day. I did not look at my mother, nor did I acknowledge my sister's venom. I was watching Winston. The billionaire's eyes were locked onto the spot where the black card had just been. He knew exactly what that logo meant. Apex Paradigm was not just a private equity firm. We were corporate executioners. We specialized in hostile takeovers, sweeping in when bloated, mismanaged companies were drowning in debt, buying up their liabilities, and restructuring them with ruthless efficiency. And Winston knew better than anyone that Vanguard Properties was currently drowning. Winston stepped forward, entirely ignoring the vile insults my family was hurling at me. He looked like a man standing on the gallows staring at the person holding the lever. He breathed my name and asked if I was the managing partner. I replied softly, my tone carrying the absolute chill of a boardroom execution. I told him I was the chief executive officer. I explained that I founded Apex 5 years ago and that I oversaw all acquisitions, including the ones currently on the docket for this fiscal quarter. Winston closed his eyes, a look of profound nausea washing over his face. He swayed slightly on his feet. The $15,000 florist bill was a distraction. The real issue was the $300 million debt note. Vanguard had defaulted on a note that Apex Paradigm had quietly purchased 2 weeks ago. Winston choked out that he needed some air. He turned away from our circle, grabbed Jamal by the lapel of his custom tuxedo, and practically dragged his massive son toward the terrace doors. The heavy glass doors of the terrace swung shut behind Winston and Jamal, sealing them out in the cool evening air. Brenda whipped around to face me, her eyes practically vibrating with fury. She hissed at me, demanding to know what was wrong with me. She asked if I saw his face and accused me of completely disgusting him with my obnoxious display. I stated flatly that I had simply paid a bill she could not afford, slipping the metal card back into my clutch. Richard stepped closer, invading my personal space, his face red with suppressed rage. He told me I had flashed some fake prop card to a billionaire and asked if I had any idea how embarrassing that was. He insisted Winston dealt with real money and probably thought I was mocking him. He yelled that my pathetic attempts to look successful were going to ruin my sister's wedding. He glared at me and said I always had to ruin everything. Brittany let out a dramatic sigh, fanning herself with her heavily ringed hand. She complained to our father that I always did this and that I could not stand it when she was the center of attention. She criticized my depressing black dress, saying I looked like I was attending a funeral, and accused me of playing pretend with fake metal credit cards just to steal her spotlight. I looked at the dress Brittany was wearing. It was a custom designer piece that I knew for a fact had drained my parents' remaining home equity line of credit. They were practically bankrupting themselves for this weekend. They were taking on crippling interest rates entirely to impress a family that viewed them as nothing more than temporary entertainment. They were financially bleeding to death for a man they barely knew. Before I could point out the absolute irony of their financial situation, the terrace doors opened again. Jamal strode back into the ballroom. He was alone. His chest was puffed out, though I noticed a slight rigidness in his shoulders that had not been there before. He smoothed the lapels of his custom tuxedo and forced a broad, arrogant smile as he rejoined our circle, waving to a few guests along the way. Brenda asked if everything was all right with Winston. Her tone instantly morphed back into that sickeningly sweet register she reserved for people with higher tax brackets. She practically fawned over him. Jamal waved a hand dismissively, picking up a fresh glass of champagne from a passing waiter. He assured us his father was fine and claimed he just felt a bit of indigestion. He said you know how these older guys get when they eat too much rich food. Plus, he added his father was handling a massive commercial acquisition right now, and the stress of running a real estate empire takes its toll on the old man. He turned his gaze to me, his dark eyes narrowing with undisguised contempt. He announced that his father told him to come back inside and handle the guests. He also mentioned Winston did not want to be bothered by any more bizarre interruptions tonight. He told me he highly suggested I blend into the wallpaper for the rest of the evening. He boasted that they had important investors here tonight, people who actually move markets, not people who push pencils for a meager hourly wage. I held his gaze, my expression completely unreadable. I asked him to confirm that he was the chief operating officer of Vanguard Properties. Jamal smirked clearly, eager to boast in front of his future in-laws. He confirmed that was right and bragged that he ran the day-to-day operations. He proudly stated that he managed the cash flow, the asset distribution, and the operational strategy for an $800 million portfolio. He sneered that it was a level of responsibility I could not even begin to comprehend from my little cubicle. I replied that his statement was fascinating. I kept my voice as smooth as glass. I pointed out that as the chief operating officer, he must be fully aware of the company's current debt-to-equity ratio. Jamal frowned, suddenly caught off guard by the corporate terminology. For a split second, a flash of genuine panic crossed his face before he masked it with aggressive arrogance. He warned me not to try to use big words I read on the internet. He told me to stay in my lane and said my job was to sit quietly tomorrow and not embarrass his bride. He commanded me to leave the high-level finance to the men who actually own the buildings. He turned his back to me, wrapping a possessive arm around Brittany's waist and pulling her close. My parents beamed at them, utterly captivated by his false bravado. They saw a prince, a golden ticket out of their suburban mediocrity. I saw a man drowning in a $300 million deficit, desperately pretending he still knew how to swim. The rest of the evening blurred into a sickening display of my family groveling before the Vanguard executives. Winston never returned from the terrace. Jamal smoothly lied to the guests, claiming his father had to take an urgent international business call and left early. I knew the truth. Winston was likely having a full-blown panic attack in the back of his chauffeur-driven limousine, realizing his entire empire was currently sitting in the palm of my hand. We eventually left the Oakbridge Country Club and piled into a massive black luxury SUV. My parents had rented the vehicle for the weekend exclusively to keep up appearances with the in-laws. I knew for a fact their credit cards were completely maxed out, yet here they were pretending to be American royalty. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing us inside the suffocating leather interior. The silence only lasted for about 2 blocks, before Richard turned around from the front passenger seat. He glared at me through the darkness of the cabin. His voice bounced off the plush interior, hard and final. He announced he was seriously considering uninviting me from the wedding reception tomorrow. He stated I was an absolute disaster tonight and a massive liability to the family image. He accused me of trying to sabotage Brittany because I was jealous of her youth and her wealthy fiancé. Brittany whined from the middle seat, adjusting the air conditioning vents. She told our father he had to let me come. She complained that if I did not show up, Jamal's family would ask questions, and it would look weird to the high-profile guests. She told Dad to just make sure I stayed at table 19. She reminded him it was right next to the kitchen swinging doors, and nobody would even know I was there. Brenda added her bitter voice from the driver's side. She glared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. She said my behavior tonight was disrespectful and arrogant. She swore that if I did a single thing to jeopardize this union tomorrow, she would personally ensure I never stepped foot in their house again. She promised I would be absolutely dead to this family. I did not respond. I did not need to defend myself to people who were willingly walking off a financial cliff blindfolded. Their threats were entirely hollow, built on a foundation of sand that was rapidly washing away beneath their feet. Instead of engaging in their petty squabbles, I pulled my phone from my clutch. I opened my encrypted enterprise messaging application. I selected the highly secured group chat labeled Apex Executive Committee. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard with practiced precision. I typed a message demanding a full forensic overnight audit on Vanguard Properties with a Priority Level 1 designation. Within seconds, a reply appeared from my lead financial analyst. He was a ruthless corporate investigator who charged $2,000 an hour for his expertise. He asked if we were looking at the $300 million defaulted debt note we recently acquired. I typed my response, the glow of the screen illuminating the cold satisfaction in my eyes. I instructed him to look much deeper than the surface debt. I explained that Jamal claimed he was actively managing their daily cash flow. I demanded a complete trace on every single dollar moving through Vanguard's operational accounts over the last 24 months. I told my team to look for shell corporations' offshore transfers, unauthorized liquidations, and any sign of embezzlement. I told them to find the rot. The analyst replied immediately. He confirmed it would be done and promised the preliminary data package would be compiled and delivered to me by tomorrow morning, well before the wedding ceremony began. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my bag. I turned my attention back to the city skyline passing by the tinted window. Let Brenda and Richard threaten me with banishment. Let Brittany dream of her borrowed luxury and imported orchids. Let Jamal pretend he was a titan of industry untouchable by the law. Tomorrow, they were all going to learn a very painful lesson about corporate gravity. True power did not need to boast at a country club dinner. True power operated in the shadows, armed with raw data and unlimited capital ready to execute without a shred of mercy. The sun rose over the city with a sharp, blinding clarity that perfectly matched my mood. I was awake long before the rest of my family, sitting in the corner armchair of my modest hotel room with a black coffee and my encrypted tablet. My executive team had been working through the night. The financial data was already flowing in, painting a picture of corporate rot so severe that Vanguard Properties was essentially a walking corpse. Jamal had not just mismanaged the company, he had actively bled it dry. A frantic pounding on my hotel room door shattered the quiet focus of my morning. Before I could even stand up, the door swung open. My mother had apparently bullied the concierge into giving her a spare key card. Brenda stormed into my room fully dressed in her expensive mother-of-the-bride gown, even though the ceremony was hours away. Her face was flushed, her makeup slightly smeared from sweat, and she looked like a woman on the verge of a complete nervous breakdown. She pointed a trembling finger at me and demanded to know what I had done. I calmly locked my tablet screen and asked her to clarify. Brenda paced across the carpet, wringing her hands together. She screamed that Jamal was missing. The groomsmen were supposed to be having a private luxury brunch on the rooftop terrace, paid for by Winston, but neither Jamal nor his father had shown up. The entire wedding planner team was in full panic mode. Brenda stopped pacing and glared at me with pure hatred. She accused me of causing this disaster. She claimed my poverty energy from last night had completely disgusted Winston. She shouted that billionaires did not want to associate with families who had embarrassing low-level accountant daughters flashing fake metal credit cards. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I found it highly amusing that she thought my poverty energy was the problem, when the reality was that Winston was currently hiding in a boardroom somewhere, desperately trying to figure out how to stop me from liquidating his entire life work. Before Brenda could continue her hysterical rant, my father pushed his way into the room. Richard looked just as panicked as my mother, but his anxiety was masked by a layer of aggressive authority. He was clutching a thick manila envelope against his chest. He slammed the door shut behind him and marched directly toward me. He told Brenda to calm down, insisting they were going to fix this. He looked down at me, his eyes cold and calculating. He threw the manila envelope onto the small glass table next to my coffee. I looked at the envelope and asked what it was. Richard puffed out his chest. He announced that it was a transfer of deed and a relinquishment of inheritance rights. He reminded me of the property my late Aunt Beatrice had left to me 2 years ago. It was a charming, fully paid-off house in the suburbs worth roughly $600,000. My family had always been furious that Beatrice left it exclusively to me, knowing perfectly well that Richard and Brenda would have immediately sold it to fund their lavish lifestyle. Richard tapped the envelope forcefully. He stated that Winston and Jamal were clearly having second thoughts about merging their elite bloodline with our family. He insisted we needed to offer them a gesture of good faith, a tangible asset, to prove we brought actual financial value to the table. He demanded I sign the house over to Jamal as a dowry offering to secure the marriage. I stared at him, genuinely impressed by the sheer audacity of his delusion. I asked him if he was seriously demanding I surrender my only inherited property to a man I barely knew just to buy his family approval. Brenda stepped forward, her face twisting into an ugly sneer. She yelled that I was a selfish, ungrateful child. She reminded me that Brittany was marrying into American royalty. She insisted Jamal was a chief operating officer of a massive empire, and a $600,000 house was nothing to them, but it would show Winston that we respected their wealth. She told me I did not need a house that big anyway since I was completely alone and had no prospects. Richard pulled a silver pen from his pocket and threw it on top of the envelope. He leaned over me, his face turning an angry shade of purple. He ordered me to sign the papers immediately. He threatened that if Jamal called off this wedding because he felt insulted by my behavior last night, he would sue me for every penny of the wedding costs. He swore he would destroy whatever pathetic little life I had built for myself. I looked at the pen, then at the envelope, and finally at my parents. They were willing to strip me of my only safety net just to appease a man they perceived as rich. They had no idea that the man they were worshipping was currently bankrupt, and the daughter they were threatening held the keys to the entire kingdom. I crossed my legs, resting my hands comfortably in my lap, and let the silence stretch for a moment. It was a negotiation tactic I frequently used in the boardroom, forcing the other party to sit in the discomfort of their own ridiculous demands. Richard shifted his weight, his face growing redder by the second, while Brenda continued to glare at me with a mixture of hatred and desperation. I looked directly at my father and asked him to explain the logic of his demand. I pointed out that he just claimed Winston and Jamal were titans of the commercial real estate sector. I reminded him that Jamal bragged last night about managing an $800 million portfolio. I then asked why a family with that level of supposed wealth would need a $600,000 suburban house from me to feel respected. Richard slammed his hand down on the small glass table, rattling my coffee cup. He yelled that it was not about the money, but about the gesture. He claimed wealthy families expected a certain level of financial contribution from the bride's side to prove they were not just gold diggers. He insisted this was standard practice in high society and accused me of being too ignorant and socially inept to understand how real power worked. I picked up my coffee, took another sip, and set it down precisely where it was before. I told him his explanation made absolutely no sense. I stated that if Vanguard Properties was as liquid and successful as Jamal claimed, they would not care about a modest property in the suburbs. I suggested that perhaps they were the ones who were desperate for cash, not us. Brenda gasped, loudly, dramatically pressing her hand to her chest. She screamed that I was insane and accused me of trying to sabotage my sister out of pure jealousy. She ranted that Jamal was a visionary executive and Winston was a legend, and I was sitting in a cheap hotel room trying to analyze their corporate strategy. She ordered me to stop playing pretend accountant and sign the document immediately before I ruined everything. I picked up the manila envelope and slid the papers out. I scanned the legal jargon quickly. It was a standard quitclaim deed drafted poorly, transferring sole ownership of the property to Vanguard Holdings, LLC. It was not even going directly to Jamal. It was going straight into the corporate entity. I looked up at Richard and asked who drafted this document. I pointed out that it was transferring the asset to a corporate holding company, not to Jamal personally. I asked my father if he realized he was essentially donating my inheritance to a commercial real estate conglomerate to cover their operational costs. Richard snatched the pen off the table and shoved it toward my face. He ordered me to stop reading it and just sign the bottom line. He claimed the lawyers handled the details, and it did not matter what name was on the LLC. He reiterated his threat, promising that if I did not sign it right now, he would call security to have me forcibly removed from the hotel and banned from the wedding venue. I took the pen from his hand, rolling it smoothly between my fingers. I did not sign the document. I told him I found it highly suspicious that the groom and the groom's father were suddenly missing on the morning of the wedding. I hypothesized that perhaps they were dealing with a massive financial crisis and needed every liquid asset they could get their hands on, including my house. Brenda lunged forward, her face contorted with rage. She tried to grab the papers from my hand, but I smoothly pulled them out of her reach. She screamed that I was a vile, jealous creature. She told me I would never be half the woman Brittany was, and that I would die alone in my cubicle. She ordered me to give her the papers so she could forge my signature if she had to, screaming that she would not let me destroy her family's future. I stood up slowly, towering over my mother in my bare feet. I looked down at her with absolute coldness. I told her the family's future was already destroyed, she just did not know it yet. I folded the legal documents neatly in half and slid them into the inner pocket of my blazer hanging on the chair. I told Richard I would hold on to the deed for now. I promised him I would bring it to the wedding venue and hand it over to Winston personally. Richard narrowed his eyes, clearly suspicious, but too desperate to argue further. He pointed a warning finger at me. He told me to make sure I gave it directly to Winston before the ceremony started. He warned me that if I embarrassed them again, he would make sure I never worked in this city again. I grabbed my hotel keycard and my phone. I told him he had absolutely no idea how this city worked. I walked past them, leaving them fuming in the center of my hotel room, and headed toward the elevator to prepare for the destruction of Vanguard Properties. I stepped into the elevator, the heavy steel doors sliding shut and cutting off the muffled sound of my mother screaming in the hallway. Just as the elevator car began its rapid descent toward the lobby, my phone vibrated in my hand. I glanced at the digital display. It was an unknown premium area code, but I already knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. Jamal did not bother with a polite greeting. He immediately launched into a hostile tirade, his voice dripping with the kind of forced arrogance men use when they are secretly terrified. He told me my father had just called him panicking about my refusal to sign the property deed. He demanded to know what my underlying problem was. He angrily asked if I was intentionally trying to ruin my sister's spectacular wedding day just to stroke my own massive ego. I calmly watched the illuminated floor numbers tick down above the elevator doors. I told Jamal I found it highly irregular for the chief operating officer of a massive $800 million real estate empire to be personally calling a low-level accountant to beg for a modest $600,000 suburban house on the very morning of his wedding. I directly asked him if Vanguard Properties was currently facing a severe liquidity crisis that I should know about. Jamal let out a harsh, patronizing laugh. It echoed through the phone speaker, sounding incredibly thin and desperate. He told me I knew absolutely nothing about corporate cash flow or high-level financial leverage. He claimed that holding liquid assets was simply a standard strategy for scaling large-scale commercial acquisitions. He insisted they did not actually need my pathetic little house in the suburbs to survive. He lied smoothly, stating his father, Winston, merely wanted a solid gesture of good faith to prove my family was not a bunch of financial parasites latching onto his massive inheritance. He was clearly regurgitating corporate buzzwords he had probably read in a cheap introductory business magazine. It was genuinely embarrassing to listen to him speak. I reached into my tailored blazer pocket, my fingers gently brushing against the folded manila envelope containing the unsigned quitclaim deed. I told Jamal that if this demand was truly just a symbolic gesture of good faith, there was absolutely no rush to finalize the paperwork. I stated firmly that I would never sign any legally binding property documents without having my own corporate legal counsel thoroughly review the specific transfer clauses. His tone instantly shifted from patronizing to explicitly threatening. He sharply warned me not to play childish games with him today. He said I was entirely out of my depth and dealing with forces I could not comprehend. He claimed my parents were already on the verge of total bankruptcy, just trying to pay for their tiny fraction of this extravagant wedding. He swore that if I did not hand over that executed deed today, he would publicly humiliate our entire family at the reception. He threatened to stand at the elegant altar and tell all his wealthy investors exactly how desperate and pathetic we truly were. I smiled coldly at my own reflection in the polished mirrored elevator doors. I told Jamal that public humiliation sounded like a completely terrible way to celebrate a joyful marriage. I promised him I would bring the unsigned deed to the Vanguard estate venue. I told him I intended to speak with his father directly about this so-called gesture of good faith before the ceremony commenced. I casually suggested that if Winston was the brilliant visionary titan everyone claimed he was, he would surely understand my desire to protect my hard-earned assets. Jamal angrily snapped that his father did not have the time to deal with a stubborn, jealous spinster today. He aggressively ordered me to sign the legal paper, hand it over to my father immediately, and sit quietly in the back corner of the venue like I was specifically instructed to do. He fiercely swore that if I caused even a single ripple of drama today, his private security team would physically drag me out of the estate and throw me into the street. The line went dead with a sharp click before I could even formulate a response. I lowered the phone, feeling a deep sense of absolute victory, Jamal was actively panicking, trying to intimidate me into handing over a free asset to plug the gaping holes in his sinking corporate ship. The elevator chimed softly, and the doors opened into the grand hotel lobby. I adjusted my jacket, completely unfazed by his empty threats, and walked confidently toward the exit. I stepped out of the rideshare vehicle and took a moment to observe the Vanguard estate. Calling it a venue was a gross understatement. It was a sprawling 40-acre compound located on the most exclusive stretch of coastline in the state. The main house was an architectural marvel of glass and imported stone, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens, sculpted hedges, and a massive reflecting pool that led straight to the ocean. Winston had essentially built a monument to his own ego. It was an intimidating display of wealth designed to make anyone who entered feel small and insignificant. Today, however, it just looked like a bloated, overleveraged asset waiting to be liquidated. The financial inequality of the wedding setup was immediately blatant and intentionally cruel. As I walked down the long cobblestone driveway toward the ceremony seating, I noticed the strict division. The groom's side of the aisle was packed with high-profile politicians, local celebrities, and corporate titans. They were seated in plush velvet chairs under a custom-built floral archway that probably cost more than my parents' entire net worth. My family's side of the aisle, however, was a stark contrast. It was sparsely populated by distant relatives, neighbors, and a few of Brittany's influencer friends. Our side had standard wooden folding chairs. It was a visual representation of how the Vanguard family viewed us as cheap filler to round out the aesthetic of the event. As I made my way toward the back rows, the whispering began. I could feel the eyes of my extended family boring into the back of my head. Aunt Susan leaned over to Uncle Gary, pointing a heavily ringed finger in my direction. I heard her mutter something about how disrespectful it was for me to wear a black suit to a wedding as if I were attending a funeral. My cousin Todd, who had barely held a steady job in 10 years, smirked and whispered to his wife that I probably bought my outfit at a discount department store. They were all enforcing my designated role as the family scapegoat. It was easier for them to mock me than to acknowledge their own mediocrity. My mother had clearly spent the morning calling everyone on our side of the family, planting seeds of preemptive damage control. She likely told them I was jealous, unstable, and trying to ruin Brittany's big day. They looked at me not with familial warmth, but with a mixture of pity and disdain. I ignored them entirely. I walked past the designated family rows and found my assigned seat. True to my mother's threat, I was placed in the very last row at the farthest edge of the aisle, right next to the massive outdoor speakers that would soon be blaring the wedding march. It was the absolute worst seat in the house. I sat down smoothly, adjusting the crease of my tailored trousers, and crossed my legs. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of the entire spectacle. I watched my father frantically schmoozing with some of the lower-level Vanguard executives, sweating through his rented tuxedo as he tried to secure business connections he would never actually get. I saw my mother hovering near the floral arrangements, nervously adjusting the petals, terrified that something would go wrong, and she would be blamed. They were entirely consumed by the illusion of the event. They did not notice the subtle signs of chaos brewing beneath the surface. I, however, had trained myself to spot corporate panic from a mile away. I noticed the frantic whispering among the event coordinators. I saw the head of security furiously pacing near the main entrance, speaking urgently into his earpiece. The catering staff seemed unusually tense, huddled in small groups near the outdoor kitchens. But the most telling sign was the complete absence of the groom and his father. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than 20 minutes, and neither Jamal nor Winston was anywhere to be seen. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was another message from my lead analyst. He confirmed that the preliminary audit was complete and the data was far worse than we initially suspected. He stated that Jamal had not just embezzled funds, he had actively forged Winston's signature on multiple high-level bridge loans to cover his tracks. The entire $800 million Vanguard portfolio was a house of cards, and the wind was already blowing. I typed a quick reply instructing him to prepare the final executive summary and have it ready for immediate secure transmission. I locked my phone and leaned back in my cheap wooden folding chair. Let my relatives whisper. Let my parents sweat. The real show was about to begin, and I had a front row seat to the demolition. A tap on my shoulder pulled me from my thoughts. I looked up to see a tall man in a tailored dark suit with a transparent earpiece standing directly beside my folding chair. He leaned down, his voice barely a whisper against the gentle ocean breeze. He respectfully informed me that Mr. Winston urgently requested my presence inside the main house. I glanced at my parents a few rows ahead. Richard was still anxiously checking his watch, and Brenda was furiously fanning herself with a ceremony program. Neither noticed me stand up and smooth the wrinkles from my dark suit. They were too busy panicking about the missing groom to care about the missing scapegoat. I followed the security detail away from the outdoor seating area. We walked away from the whispering relatives and the opulent floral archway, moving swiftly up the cobblestone path toward the massive glass and stone mansion. We bypassed the busy catering kitchens and entered through a discreet side door. The chaotic noise of the wedding preparations instantly vanished, replaced by the heavy, expensive silence of the estate interior. The guard led me down a long hallway lined with abstract art, finally stopping in front of a pair of towering mahogany doors. He opened one side, gestured for me to enter, and closed it firmly behind me with a loud, definitive click. I stepped into a sprawling private library. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes stretched across the room, smelling of old paper and cedar. At the far end, standing behind a massive antique desk, was Winston. The billionaire titan of commercial real estate looked absolutely terrible. His custom tuxedo jacket was discarded carelessly on a leather armchair. His silk bow tie was undone, hanging loosely around his neck. He was clutching a crystal glass of amber liquid, and his hands were trembling so violently that the ice cubes loudly rattled against the glass. He looked a full decade older than he had at the country club just 12 hours prior. He swallowed hard, setting the glass down on the desk before he dropped it. He looked at me not with the condescending boredom of a billionaire meeting a peasant, but with the stark terror of a man staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. The power dynamic in the room shifted so violently, I could almost feel the air pressure change. Winston gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. He told me his financial team had just confirmed the terrifying rumors. He said they traced the routing numbers from the entity that bought Vanguard's $300 million defaulted debt note last week. He took a ragged breath and stated that the holding company traced directly back to Apex Paradigm. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes and acknowledged that I was the one holding the axe over his entire legacy. I remained standing near the center of the Persian rug, my posture perfectly straight, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I calmly confirmed his assessment. I told him Apex Paradigm acquired the debt note at a steep discount because traditional banks viewed Vanguard as a toxic, unsalvageable asset. I explained that my firm was preparing for a hostile takeover and full liquidation of his commercial properties. Winston practically collapsed into his heavy leather desk chair. The fight completely drained out of him. He looked up at me and began to beg. The man who had built an $800 million empire from the ground up was now pleading for his corporate life to the woman my family called a miserable failure. He begged me not to let the foolishness of my parents or the blind arrogance of his son dictate a financial execution. He swore that he would personally apologize to me in front of everyone. He offered to publicly humiliate my parents if I wanted. He promised to give me whatever I demanded as long as I agreed to restructure the massive debt instead of stripping his company down and selling it for parts. He rambled about his legacy, saying Vanguard was his entire life work, a testament to decades of sacrifice and ruthless ambition. He pleaded with me to understand that he could not watch it be torn apart and auctioned off to his competitors. He swore he could fix the cash flow issues if I just gave him a 6-month grace period. I watched him grovel, feeling no pity. I told Winston that I never let personal grievances dictate my investment strategies. I assured him my family's pathetic behavior had zero bearing on Vanguard's fate. I stated that my decision to liquidate his company was based entirely on the catastrophic data my forensic auditors had uncovered just this morning. Winston stared at me, his chest heaving as he struggled to process my words. He asked what data I was talking about. He insisted the company was just experiencing a temporary liquidity crunch due to aggressive expansion. He claimed the market was merely shifting, and Vanguard was perfectly positioned to rebound if we just restructured the debt note. I pulled my encrypted tablet from my blazer pocket and unlocked the screen. I told him he was either dangerously incompetent or actively lying to himself. I placed the device flat on the massive antique desk between us and turned it so he could see the glowing financial dashboards. I tapped a few keystrokes to bring up the consolidated balance sheets my team had compiled overnight. I coldly broke down his supposed empire. I pointed to the red columns and explained that Vanguard was currently drowning in exactly $300 million of toxic, unrecoverable debt. I detailed how his flagship commercial properties in the downtown district were operating at a massive loss. I noted that he had falsified occupancy rates to secure massive bridge loans from secondary lenders, and those loans had all entered default status over the past 48 hours. I told him his entire portfolio was essentially a mirage built on fraudulent valuations and desperate short-term borrowing. Winston wiped a heavy bead of sweat from his temple. He argued that every major real estate firm leveraged their assets. He pleaded that it was just the cost of doing business at this magnitude. He said all he needed was an injection of capital to finalize a new development deal that would wipe the slate clean. I shook my head and told him no bank in the country would touch Vanguard now. I reminded him that his traditional lenders had already quietly abandoned him. I explained that when Wall Street smelled blood in the water, the institutional investors scattered. That was exactly why Apex Paradigm swooped in. My firm specialized in acquiring distressed assets that were too toxic for traditional financial institutions. We bought his master debt note for pennies on the dollar because Vanguard was universally considered a lost cause by every major financial analyst. I leaned slightly forward, resting my palms firmly on the edge of his mahogany desk. I told him Apex Paradigm was not a charity and we were not a rescue fund. We were the corporate executioners. I made it explicitly clear that we were the absolute only buyer left on the entire market willing to touch his toxic portfolio. And because we held the primary debt note, we held absolute total control over his corporate survival. Winston looked down at the tablet, his eyes rapidly scanning the undeniable proof of his total failure. His hands gripped the edge of the desk so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He whispered that I could not just liquidate them. He said selling off the physical assets piece by piece would destroy thousands of jobs and wipe out his entire family legacy forever. He begged me to consider a friendly merger or a structured buyout that would leave the Vanguard name intact and preserve his public dignity. I informed him that a structured buyout required a solid foundation of trust and a viable core business model. I told him Vanguard possessed neither of those things. I stated that holding the axe meant I had a strict fiduciary duty to my own investors to maximize returns, and the fastest way to extract value from his failures was a ruthless, hostile takeover. I explained the process plainly so he could understand his immediate future. Apex would seize the collateral, dissolve the existing board of directors, terminate the entire executive leadership team, and auction off the physical properties to our competitors. Vanguard Properties would completely cease to exist by the end of the upcoming fiscal quarter. The billionaire closed his eyes, looking utterly defeated. He sank back into his luxurious leather chair, the fight completely drained from his massive frame. He weakly asked why I was even here today if the final decision was already made. He asked why I did not just send a team of corporate lawyers to serve the foreclosure notices and be done with it. He wondered aloud if I had come to this wedding simply to gloat and watch his family suffer the way my family had suffered. I stood up perfectly straight and looked down at him. I told him I did not operate on petty vengeance. I explained that I had fully intended to sign the restructuring agreement last night. I had been willing to negotiate a path forward that kept him in the chairman's seat. I told him Vanguard was bleeding cash, but up until this morning, I truly believed the wounds were simply the result of poor management and bad market timing. I tapped the screen of my tablet one final time, pulling up a deeply hidden forensic ledger my analysts had cracked just an hour ago. I told him everything changed when we looked past the toxic debt and closely examined the daily operational cash flow handled by his son Jamal. I tapped the highlighted red figures on the glowing screen and pushed the tablet closer to his trembling hands. I told him my analysts did not just look at the high-level valuations. We dug deep into the granular day-to-day operational accounts. I explained that Vanguard was bleeding cash long before the commercial real estate market shifted, and it was not because of poor leasing agreements or aggressive expansion. It was because someone inside his inner circle was actively siphoning money out the back door. I pointed to a complex series of wire transfers routed through a web of shell corporations and offshore holding companies. I stated clearly that over the past 24 months, exactly $45 million of company operating funds had vanished. I watched his eyes scan the damning numbers, knowing he was finally realizing the absolute magnitude of the internal betrayal happening right under his nose. It was not lost in bad investments or market fluctuations. It was stolen. I told him it was a textbook case of corporate embezzlement cleverly disguised as vendor payments and fictitious consulting fees. Winston stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He vehemently shook his head, denying the possibility. He claimed his internal auditing team was the best in the industry, and they would have easily caught a financial leak that massive. He insisted the numbers had to be a mistake, a gross miscalculation by my analysts. I leaned over the desk, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I assured him my analysts did not make mistakes. They were the most ruthless forensic accountants on Wall Street. I told him the reason his internal auditors missed the $45 million hole was because the person authorizing the fraudulent transfers was the exact same person overseeing the auditing department. I reminded him that his son, the chief operating officer he was so incredibly proud of, had complete unchecked authority over the daily cash flow. Winston physically recoiled as if I had struck him across the face. He gasped, his hands flying up to grip his head. He mumbled repeatedly that Jamal would never do something like this. He frantically tried to rationalize it, saying Jamal had a massive trust fund and an enormous executive salary, so he had absolutely no reason to steal from his own future inheritance. He begged me to look at other executives blaming his vice presidents. I stood up straight and buttoned my suit jacket, completely devoid of sympathy. I told him greed rarely required a logical reason. I stated that the stolen funds were currently sitting in untraceable offshore accounts, completely out of the reach of Vanguard creditors. I explained that this catastrophic discovery fundamentally changed our entire negotiation posture. Apex Paradigm was perfectly willing to restructure bad debt for an honest failing business, but we absolutely refused to merge with a criminal enterprise. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single sheet of folded paper. It was a draft of a friendly buyout agreement, the exact corporate lifeline he had been begging for. I placed it on the desk next to the glowing tablet. I told him I brought this document today with good intentions. I explained it would have kept him as the figurehead chairman while my firm quietly handled the massive debt, saving his legacy and protecting his remaining personal assets. Then I picked up the heavy brass pen from his desk. I told him I was now fully prepared to shred this contract and immediately initiate the hostile liquidation protocols. Winston lunged forward, his hands slamming onto the document. He begged me to stop promising he would fire whoever was responsible and repay the missing funds from his personal accounts. I pulled the document out from under his sweating hands. I looked at the grandfather clock ticking in the corner of the vast library. I told him the wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin shortly, followed by the extravagant reception his stolen company funds were paying for. I issued my final terms. I gave him exactly 2 hours to find the rat. I demanded he identify the embezzler, secure a full confession, and handle the situation before the reception speeches began. I made it explicitly clear that if he tried to cover for his son, or if he failed to deliver the thief within the next 2 hours, I would execute the total liquidation of Vanguard properties. The entire portfolio would be seized by tomorrow morning, and both he and his son would face severe federal indictment for wire fraud. I left the encrypted tablet on his desk, turned my back on the utterly broken billionaire, and slowly walked toward the heavy mahogany doors without waiting for his final response. I reached the heavy mahogany doors and grasped the cool brass handles. Behind me, the sound of Winston collapsing back into his leather chair echoed through the cavernous library. It was followed immediately by the harsh, ragged sound of a man struggling to pull air into his lungs. He was hyperventilating. The sheer terror of losing an $800 million empire, coupled with the realization that his son was a federal criminal, had broken his physical composure. I heard his frantic gasping. I heard the sharp shatter of crystal as his elbow clipped the heavy Scotch glass he had left on the desk, sending it crashing to the hardwood floor. The expensive amber liquid pooled on the priceless Persian rug. I did not turn around to check on him. I did not rush to offer him a glass of water. I simply paused with the door cracked open, letting the sliver of light from the hallway cut into the dim library. I spoke over my shoulder with the exact same emotional detachment I used when correcting a failing first-year intern at my firm. I told him to control his breathing and focus on the deadline. I reminded him that panic was a completely unproductive emotion in the boardroom, and that the clock was already ticking down. I coldly advised him to use his remaining time to secure a full confession from Jamal rather than hyperventilating over spilled liquor. I stepped out into the quiet hallway, pulling the door shut behind me. The latch caught with a firm, definitive click, sealing the billionaire inside his own personal panic room. The private security guard stationed just outside the doors looked at me with a deeply confused expression. He was clearly expecting his powerful boss to escort me out, or at least shout an aggressive order from inside the room. Instead, there was only a chilling silence. I simply adjusted my suit jacket, smoothed the lapels, and walked right past the massive guard without offering a single word of explanation. I navigated the maze of abstract art and expensive marble floors with absolute calm. I walked toward the side exit, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone. My heart rate had not elevated a single beat during that interaction. When I pushed the exterior door open, the bright afternoon sun and the chaotic sounds of the lavish wedding washed over me. It was an incredibly jarring transition. Inside that dark library, a legendary corporate titan was drowning in the reality of federal indictments and total financial ruin. Outside, a string quartet was cheerfully playing upbeat classical music, and waiters in crisp white uniforms were balancing silver trays of expensive champagne. Every single flower, every crystal glass, and every perfectly manicured hedge was paid for with embezzled cash. It was a masterfully crafted illusion of absolute wealth, and I was holding the needle ready to pop the balloon. I walked slowly down the cobblestone path, blending back into the crowd of arriving guests. I spotted my parents immediately. Richard was still anxiously pacing near our designated seating area, checking his watch and muttering about the delayed groom. Brenda was frantically adjusting her designer hat, desperately trying to flag down an official event photographer to capture her standing next to a wealthy local politician. Neither of them had even noticed my brief absence. To them, I was just an embarrassing afterthought. They were forced to tolerate an invisible scapegoat they planned to hide in the back row. I approached the seating area just as a sudden wave of applause rippled through the front rows. The groom had finally made his appearance. Jamal strutted out from a side garden path flanked by his groomsmen. He looked incredibly smug, waving to his wealthy guests with the confident swagger of a man who believed he owned the world. He had absolutely no idea that his father was currently hyperventilating in the library, staring at a tablet that contained his impending prison sentence. I walked past the whispering relatives and took my assigned seat in the back row next to the audio speakers. My encrypted phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and read the incoming message. It was from my lead executive assistant. She informed me that she had breached the estate perimeter and was waiting in a black SUV with the physical printed copies of the forensic audit files. She asked for the green light to approach the reception area. I typed a quick reply telling her to hold her position until the speeches began. I locked my phone and leaned back in my cheap folding chair to watch the disaster unfold. I locked my phone and leaned back in my cheap folding chair to watch the disaster unfold. I barely had time to cross my legs before a hand clamped down viciously on my shoulder. Nails dug through the fabric of my dark suit jacket. I did not need to look up to know it was my mother. Brenda leaned down, her expensive perfume masking the sharp scent of her nervous sweat. Her voice was a venomous hiss in my ear, commanding me to stand up and follow her immediately without making a scene. I calmly uncrossed my legs and stood smoothing the lapels of my jacket. Brenda did not let go of my arm. She practically dragged me away from the folding chairs, pulling me behind a thick wall of sculpted hedges that shielded the entrance to the restricted VIP wing of the estate. We were entirely out of sight from the rest of the wedding guests. The cheerful classical music from the string quartet was muffled by the dense greenery, replaced by the sound of my mother breathing heavily through her teeth. Brenda released my arm and spun around to face me, her eyes completely wild with rage. She demanded to know what I was doing sneaking out of the main house. She told me she saw me exiting the heavy mahogany side doors with her own eyes. She accused me of trespassing in the private quarters, where Winston and the elite guests were supposed to be holding their pre-wedding briefings. Her face turned an ugly shade of crimson as she launched into a frantic tirade. She accused me of trying to steal from the estate to pay off my own pathetic credit card debts. She screamed that I was a malicious, jealous spinster who was actively trying to get our entire family arrested and thrown out of the wedding before Brittany even walked down the aisle. I stood perfectly still, letting her hurl her baseless accusations. I did not raise my voice or attempt to defend my character against her delusions. I simply looked at her with the same clinical detachment I reserved for hostile board meetings. I told her she was acting hysterical over an illusion of wealth that did not actually exist. I stated firmly that I was not the one she needed to worry about regarding arrests or financial ruin today. Brenda did not listen. She was completely consumed by her own toxic narrative and her desperate need to control me. She stepped forward, raising her hand high in the air, and brought it down hard against my cheek. The slap echoed sharply in the secluded alcove. It was a vicious, unhinged strike fueled by decades of resentment and her own desperate financial panic over the debts she had incurred for this wedding. My head snapped slightly to the side from the sudden force of the blow. A sharp, stinging sensation radiated across my skin, leaving a red mark on my cheek. I slowly turned my head back to face her. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hand to touch my injured cheek. I did not shed a single tear or show a fraction of an ounce of weakness. I simply stared into her panicked eyes with a gaze so entirely devoid of emotion that Brenda physically took a step backward. Her hand trembled as she realized I was not going to cower or cry the way I did when I was a helpless teenager trapped in her house. I broke the heavy silence, my voice dropping to a dangerous icy register. I told her she just slapped away her rescue. Brenda scoffed nervously, trying to maintain her authoritative posture despite the fear creeping into her eyes. She asked what delusional nonsense I was talking about. She claimed I had absolutely nothing to offer her and that she did not need a rescue from a miserable failure. She proudly declared that she was about to become the mother-in-law of a billionaire real estate heir, and that my pathetic attempts to sound important meant nothing to her. I stepped closer to her, forcing her to look up at me. I told her the billionaire real estate heir she was worshipping was currently dead broke. I explained that Vanguard Properties was not a kingdom, but a sinking ship dragging $300 million of toxic debt straight to the bottom of the ocean. I informed her that Jamal was not a visionary executive, but a common thief who had embezzled $45 million from his own father to pay for the very floral arrangements she was obsessing over this morning. Brenda stared at me, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. She shook her head in rapid denial, whispering that I was lying because I was jealous of my sister. I ignored her desperate denial. I told her I was the chief executive officer holding the Vanguard debt note. I explained that I had the capital and the ultimate authority to bail this entire corrupt operation out and protect our family from the massive financial fallout. I told her I could have easily shielded her and Richard from the incoming federal indictments and the aggressive creditors that would soon sweep through this estate. But because she could not suppress her need to abuse me for even one single day, I was going to let her burn with them. I turned my back on my mother, leaving her paralyzed with absolute terror behind the hedges, and walked calmly back to my seat just as the wedding march began to play. I returned to my folding chair just as the heavy wooden doors of the main estate opened. The string quartet shifted seamlessly into a grand, classical piece. Everyone stood up. I watched my father escort Brittany down the aisle. Her custom designer gown practically dragged across the imported rose petals, scattered across the cobblestones. She looked radiant, completely absorbed in the illusion of her own perfection. She had absolutely no idea her mother was currently hyperventilating behind a decorative hedge. Jamal stood at the altar waiting for her. He looked incredibly smug. He flashed a brilliant smile at the crowd, playing the role of the wealthy heir flawlessly. I looked over at the front row. Winston had finally emerged from the library. He looked like a reanimated corpse. His skin was a sickly shade of gray, his posture was slumped, and his eyes were completely hollow. He stared at his son with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound terror. My mother eventually slipped into the row opposite him, looking equally shattered. She gripped her purse so tightly her knuckles were white, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The officiant began speaking about love, trust, and the foundation of a strong marriage. I found it incredibly difficult not to laugh out loud. When it was time for the personal vows, Jamal took Brittany by the hands. He looked deeply into her eyes and delivered a speech that was undoubtedly written by a public relations firm. He promised to always protect her, to be her steadfast partner in building their family empire, and to honor her with complete and utter honesty. He spoke passionately about how their material wealth was secondary to their unbreakable bond. It was a masterclass in sociopathic deception. He was promising her an empire that my firm currently owned, using money he had stolen from his terrified father, who was standing just 10 feet away, counting down the minutes to his own ruin. Brittany wept delicate, perfectly choreographed tears. She promised to stand by him through every corporate triumph and personal challenge. She was completely unaware that her first major challenge as a wife was going to be visiting her husband through the thick glass of a federal penitentiary. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, celebrating a union built entirely on financial fraud. The guests transitioned from the outdoor ceremony to the massive grand ballroom inside the estate for the reception. The indoor space was an absolute explosion of weaponized wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, illuminating dozens of tables draped in imported silk. The tables were covered in towering arrangements of rare white orchids, the exact same flowers my mother had desperately tried to force me to pay for just the night before. Waiters immediately began circling the room with silver platters of caviar and pouring endless glasses of vintage champagne. I bypassed the elegant seating chart displayed on a golden easel near the entrance. I already knew exactly where my family had banished me for the evening. I navigated through the sea of wealthy corporate guests, moving further and further away from the extravagant elevated head table. I walked past the local politicians, the minor celebrities, and the real estate developers, who all thought they were attending the social event of the season. I finally reached table 19. It was exactly where my sister had promised it would be. It was a tiny, cramped, circular table shoved into the absolute darkest corner of the grand ballroom. It was positioned directly next to the heavy, swinging metal doors of the main catering kitchen. Every single time a frantic waiter rushed in or out with a heavy tray of food, a blast of hot, greasy air, and the loud clatter of industrial dishwashers aggressively washed over the seats. I was seated with a few distant cousins, a severely socially awkward great-uncle, and 2 empty chairs. They all immediately looked away when I sat down. They were desperate to distance themselves from the designated family failure, terrified that my supposed poverty might somehow be contagious. I pulled my wooden chair out and sat down smoothly. The tablecloth on this specific table was slightly stained near the edge, and the floral centerpiece here was noticeably smaller and already wilting compared to the magnificent displays in the center of the room. I placed my clutch on the table, smoothed my jacket, and picked up my water glass. I did not care about the blatant disrespect. From my hidden corner next to the kitchen doors, I had a perfect tactical vantage point of the entire grand ballroom. I could see Jamal laughing heartily with his groomsmen, raising his crystal champagne flute to toast his own brilliance, completely oblivious to his impending corporate destruction. I could see my parents sitting rigidly at the VIP family table alongside the Vanguard executives. They were completely unable to touch their expensive appetizers, looking like they were waiting for a bomb to detonate. Winston was nowhere to be seen in the room, likely back in his private library, desperately trying to salvage whatever was left of his shattered life. I took a slow sip of my water. I kept my eyes locked on the heavy main entrance doors of the ballroom, patiently waiting for my executive assistant to make her entrance. The final countdown had officially begun. The final countdown had officially begun. Dinner service commenced with an army of waiters carrying silver trays of roasted quail and truffle risotto. The clinking of heavy crystal glasses and the low hum of arrogant laughter filled the grand ballroom. I ate my meal in complete silence, ignoring the awkward glances from my table mates who treated me like a contagious disease. After the extravagant plates were cleared, the band abruptly stopped playing. The master of ceremonies tapped a microphone, capturing the immediate attention of the room. He excitedly announced that it was time for the groom to deliver his toast. Jamal stood up from the center of the elevated head table. He adjusted his custom silk tie and picked up his crystal champagne flute. The room instantly fell silent, hanging on his every word. He possessed an undeniable charisma, a slick magnetic energy that made it incredibly easy for him to deceive everyone in his orbit. He smiled broadly, looking out over the sea of wealthy investors and corporate sycophants. He began by thanking his father for building the Vanguard empire. I noticed Winston was slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the white tablecloth, sweating profusely and completely failing to acknowledge his son. Jamal ignored him and turned to my sister. He praised Brittany for her beauty, her style, and her understanding of what it took to operate at the highest echelons of society. Then his tone shifted. The charming smile morphed into a condescending smirk. He paced slowly behind the head table, holding the microphone close to his mouth. He declared that building a legacy required a relentless, predatory mindset. He stated that true wealth was not just about having capital, but about cutting dead weight from your life. He looked directly across the massive ballroom, his eyes searching the shadows until they locked onto my table. Jamal told the crowd that he and Brittany were a power couple destined to multiply his family assets. He paused dramatically, letting the silence stretch before delivering his punchline. He said that, unfortunately, not everyone possessed the drive to succeed in this brutal economy. He stated that every successful family had to deal with the burden of lazy family members who sit around counting pennies and resenting the success of their superiors. He gripped the microphone tightly and loudly mocked people who wasted their lives in cubicles pushing pencils for a meager hourly wage while secretly hoping for a financial handout from the real innovators of the world. The entire ballroom erupted into laughter. It was not a polite, subtle chuckle, but a cruel, roaring laugh of collective agreement. Jamal had effectively weaponized the crowd against me. He did not say my name aloud, but he absolutely did not have to. Brittany pointedly turned her head and glared directly at my dark corner. Within seconds, hundreds of guests followed her gaze. Heads swiveled in unison. Men in expensive tailored suits and women in shimmering designer gowns turned in their seats, staring directly at table 19. They looked at my modest dark suit, my wilting floral centerpiece, and my isolated position next to the kitchen doors. They pointed and whispered loudly, their faces twisting with aristocratic amusement and deep contempt. I looked over at my parents. Richard and Brenda were sitting at the VIP table, completely surrounded by the Vanguard elite. Instead of defending their eldest daughter from this vile public attack, they actively participated in the humiliation. Richard forced a loud, booming laugh, holding his champagne glass high in the air to signal his enthusiastic agreement with Jamal. Brenda covered her mouth, giggling like a desperate schoolgirl, frantically trying to prove to the billionaires at her table that she agreed with the groom. They were practically begging for scraps of approval from a man who had stolen millions. The sheer audacity of Jamal standing there lecturing the room about hard work and innovation, while actively funding this very party with embezzled corporate cash, was almost poetic. He was a spectacular fraud delivering a sermon on financial success. He raised his glass one more time, proposing a toast to those who actually build empires and firmly demanding that the failures of the world stay out of their way. The guests cheered enthusiastically, raising their glasses in unison. I did not shrink under the weight of hundreds of mocking stares. I did not drop my gaze or look down at my plate in shame. I remained perfectly still, my posture rigid, my expression a mask of absolute coldness. I looked directly past the laughing guests, past my sneering sister, and past my pathetic parents. I locked eyes with Jamal. I let him savor his manufactured moment of supremacy. He smiled at me with a vicious, triumphant grin, genuinely believing he had finally put me in my proper place. He believed he had won. He was so intoxicated by his own arrogance that he completely failed to notice his father practically hyperventilating beside him. He also failed to notice the heavy main entrance doors at the back of the ballroom slowly beginning to open. I casually checked the sleek silver watch on my wrist. The 2-hour deadline I had given Winston was officially over. The heavy brass handles of the grand ballroom doors turned with a sharp click that echoed over the fading applause. The massive doors swung open, pushed by an unseen force slicing through the stagnant atmosphere. A single figure stepped over the threshold. It was not a late guest or a confused caterer. It was my executive assistant, Sloane. Sloane was a corporate litigator who treated every task like a military operation. She wore a tailored pinstripe suit, her dark hair pulled into a severe knot. Her heels clicked against the floor with the terrifying cadence of an executioner. She carried a thick leather folio tucked securely under her arm. 2 private security guards stepped forward to intercept her. Sloane did not even break her stride. She casually flashed a laminated federal compliance badge clipped to the inside of her blazer and offered them a look so violently dismissive that both men instinctively stepped back. She bypassed the golden easel holding the seating chart and marched directly into the sea of bewildered guests. The room, which had been buzzing with cruel laughter just moments before, fell into a confused hush. Guests craned their necks, watching this corporate presence slice through the sea of expensive tuxedos. Sloane ignored the opulent floral centerpieces, the glaring politicians, and the whispered questions. Her eyes were locked entirely on my dark corner next to the kitchen doors. Jamal, still standing behind the head table with his microphone, frowned. His arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He tapped the microphone, the feedback squeal cutting through the tension. He aggressively demanded to know who she was and ordered security to remove the interloper from his private event. Sloane did not even glance in his direction. She reached table 19 and stopped perfectly squared in front of my chair. The distant relative sitting next to me physically leaned away from her, intimidated by her corporate gravity. She opened the leather folio and extracted a thick stack of documents. The top page was stamped with a massive red seal that read "Strictly Confidential and Immediate Action Required." She placed the heavy file directly onto the stained tablecloth in front of me, right next to my water glass. She leaned down, her voice crisp, professional, and entirely audible to the silent tables surrounding us. She informed me that the forensic audit was officially finalized and the transfer logs had been independently verified. She stated that the $45 million in stolen funds had been successfully traced to 3 separate offshore shell companies registered under the groom's personal identification numbers. She also confirmed that our legal team had just secured an emergency federal injunction. This meant every single Vanguard corporate account, including the ones currently funding this entire lavish reception, was frozen as of 2 minutes ago. I nodded, placing my hand flat over the red stamped file. I asked her if the federal authorities had been briefed on the situation. Sloane stood straight, adjusting the cuffs of her suit. She confirmed that the regional director of the Federal Bureau had received the encrypted data package. She added that a designated white-collar crime unit was currently standing by outside the estate perimeter. They were simply awaiting my final signal to move in and execute the arrest warrants. The sheer silence in the ballroom was deafening. The guests sitting at the tables nearest to me had heard every single word Sloane said. Whispers erupted like brush fires across the room. The words federal injunction and stolen funds spread from table to table with terrifying speed. The aristocratic amusement that had painted their faces moments ago vanished entirely. It was replaced by an uncomfortable, deeply paranoid tension. I looked up toward the VIP table. Brenda and Richard were staring at me with their mouths hanging open. Their pathetic, desperate smiles were completely wiped away. They looked from me to the imposing executive assistant standing at my side, and finally down at the thick, red stamped file resting under my hand. The gears in their minds were slowly, painfully grinding together. They frantically tried to process the impossible reality unfolding directly in front of them. Jamal gripped the microphone so hard his knuckles turned white. He barked into it, his voice losing its smooth, charismatic edge. His words cracked with a sudden, genuine panic. He yelled for the security guards again, frantically pointing at my table. He demanded they throw both of us out onto the street immediately. I picked up the red stamped file from the tablecloth. The time for sitting quietly in the shadows was completely over. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor. I stood up tall, finally ready to face the man who had just dug his own corporate grave. I stood up tall, finally ready to face the man who had just dug his own corporate grave. I picked up the heavy file from the stained tablecloth and broke the suffocating silence of the grand ballroom. My voice did not shake. It carried across the room, cutting through the heavy tension like a scalpel. I told Jamal that since he was so incredibly passionate about financial innovation and hard work, we should take a moment to review his specific contributions to the Vanguard portfolio. Jamal shouted from the elevated head table, his face flushed with a panicked, ugly red. He ordered me to shut my mouth and sit down immediately. He yelled that this was a private family event and I was ruining his bride's special day. He frantically motioned for the security guards to intervene, but the guards remained frozen near the walls, intimidated by Sloane and the explicit mention of federal authorities. I ignored his desperate commands and opened the red-stamped cover. I pulled out the top sheet of the forensic summary. I read the figures loudly and clearly, ensuring the acoustic design of the massive ballroom carried my words to every single guest. I announced that over the past 24 months, exactly $45 million had been systematically drained from Vanguard Properties' operational accounts. Gasps echoed from the tables containing the corporate investors. Those were the powerful men and women who had bought into Jamal's lies. Sloane stood rigidly by my side, her posture acting as a physical barrier against anyone who might try to snatch the files. She held a secondary folder containing the exact bank routing numbers and signature authorizations. I flipped to the second page of the audit. I detailed the exact routing mechanism for the crowd. I explained how Jamal had falsified vendor invoices to siphon the cash incrementally, keeping the transfers just under the threshold that would trigger an automatic internal review. I explained that the money was not lost to market fluctuations or poor real estate investments. It was deliberately wired into 3 separate offshore shell companies. I read the names of the fictitious entities aloud. I listed them slowly so the investors could hear exactly where their money had gone. I stated that all 3 of these phantom corporations were legally registered in the Cayman Islands under one primary beneficiary. I looked directly at Jamal and stated his full legal name. The silence in the room was so absolute you could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. Jamal gripped the edges of his table, visibly trembling. He looked around the room, making desperate eye contact with his wealthy investors, begging them not to believe me. He stammered that the documents were forged. He claimed I was a jealous, psychotic woman trying to exact revenge for being seated in the back corner of the reception. He yelled that his father would verify his innocence. I turned to the third page of the forensic audit, completely unfazed by his pathetic outburst. I told the crowd that the most fascinating part of this financial crime was not the offshore accounts, but the domestic wire transfers made in the last 48 hours. I swept my hand across the room, gesturing to the towering floral centerpieces the imported silk tablecloths, and the massive crystal chandeliers. I announced that this entire $2 million wedding reception was funded directly from a fraudulent bridge loan secured against Vanguard's failing downtown commercial properties. I looked at Brittany, who was now clutching her designer veil. Her face was drained of all color, replacing her arrogant bridal glow with stark terror. I told her that the custom silk dress she was wearing was paid for with stolen investor money. I looked at my parents, who were frozen in absolute horror at the VIP table. I informed them that the imported orchids they had practically begged me to pay for last night were actually funded by federal wire fraud. I stated clearly that every single drop of vintage champagne consumed in this room tonight was purchased with embezzled corporate funds. The grand ballroom descended into absolute chaos. The corporate investors, realizing their capital was tied up in this massive fraud, began furiously whispering to their spouses and reaching for their phones to call their legal teams. The wealthy politicians who had attended for a photo opportunity rapidly stood up, desperate to distance themselves from a massive federal scandal. The illusion of the Vanguard empire was completely shattered in a matter of minutes. It was no longer a joyful celebration of wealth and elite status. It was a live crime scene. Jamal stood at the head table, completely paralyzed, watching his entire life disintegrate in front of hundreds of people. He had built his entire persona on projecting superiority and mocking those he deemed beneath him. Now the definitive proof of his criminality was resting on the stained tablecloth of Table 19, delivered by the very woman he had just publicly humiliated. I picked up the red stamped file and stepped away from the stained tablecloth of Table 19. Sloane flanked me, her presence a silent warning to anyone who might try to interfere. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, cutting straight through the sea of shocked corporate investors and terrified politicians. The long walk gave everyone in the room ample time to witness the absolute shift in power. The aristocratic sneers had vanished, replaced by the wide-eyed panic of wealthy people realizing they were trapped in a burning building. Jamal watched me approach the elevated head table. Panic bled heavily through his carefully manicured facade, but his narcissism refused to let him surrender gracefully. He gripped the microphone, his knuckles turning bone white, and tried to rally the room one last time. He barked out a harsh, strained laugh. He told the crowd not to listen to a single word I said. He yelled that I was a financially unstable spinster who had spent years living in our parents' basement. He claimed I had forged those documents out of sheer desperation because I was pathologically jealous of my sister and her perfect life. Richard stood up from the VIP table, his face pale and slick with sweat. He waved his hands frantically and yelled at me to stop this embarrassing stunt immediately. Brenda was sobbing quietly into her expensive silk napkin, completely terrified of the social ruin crashing down around her. I ignored both of them. I reached the bottom steps of the elevated platform. Two of Jamal's large groomsmen stepped forward to block my path, puffing out their chests aggressively. Sloane smoothly unbuttoned her tailored suit jacket, revealing the edge of a sleek black shoulder holster secured over her crisp white shirt. She did not say a single word, but the threat of federal enforcement was abundantly clear. The groomsmen instantly backed away, raising their hands in rapid surrender and stepping off the stage entirely. I walked up the short flight of stairs and stopped directly in front of Jamal. He towered over me, sweating profusely, smelling of fear and heavy cologne. He sneered, his upper lip curling into an ugly snarl, and told me I was making a massive mistake. He threatened to destroy me in court and sue me for defamation. I did not blink. I reached out and firmly gripped the microphone he was holding. For a split second he tried to resist, but his grip was weak with pure terror. I pulled the heavy metal microphone easily from his trembling hand. I turned my back to him and faced the massive ballroom. The silence was absolute and suffocating. You could hear the faint mechanical hum of the air conditioning vents and the shallow, rapid breathing of the guests sitting in the front rows. I brought the microphone to my lips. I told the room that I was not a jealous sister or a bitter accountant. I formally introduced myself to the Vanguard investors and the local elite. I stated my name, and my exact corporate title as the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Paradigm, the private equity firm that currently owned their master debt note. A collective horrified gasp rippled through the front tables. The corporate titans who had just been laughing at me a few minutes ago suddenly looked like they were going to physically vomit. I opened the heavy red file again. I told Jamal that since he wanted to talk about my supposed financial instability, we should read his exact financial transactions into the public record. I read the date, the exact timestamp, and the routing number of a massive transfer made just 72 hours ago. I announced that a sum of $4.2 million was secretly moved from Vanguard's emergency payroll account into a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. I turned the page and read the corresponding invoice from the luxury wedding planner. It showed a payment of identical value processed through that exact offshore account to cover the catering, the venue rental, and the imported floral arrangements for tonight. I looked directly at the wealthy investors sitting at the tables nearest the platform. I told them that their employee pension funds and their quarterly corporate dividends were currently sitting on the plates in front of them, masquerading as roasted quail and truffle risotto. Several guests physically pushed their plates away in immediate disgust. One prominent local politician actually stood up from his chair, abandoned his wife at the table, and sprinted for the exit, absolutely desperate to avoid the inevitable media fallout and federal subpoenas. Jamal lunged forward, trying to grab the microphone back from my hand. He shouted that I was violating strict corporate confidentiality agreements and demanded I stop reading. I effortlessly stepped out of his reach. I told him he permanently lost the right to corporate confidentiality the exact moment he decided to commit federal wire fraud to pay for an extravagant party. I looked down at Brittany, who was shaking violently in her chair, and told her that her fairy tale was officially over. I did not wait for Brittany to process the absolute destruction of her manufactured reality. I raised my left hand and snapped my fingers once. It was a sharp, echoing sound that signaled Sloane to execute the next phase. My assistant did not hesitate. She walked briskly to the main audio-visual control podium, located just off the edge of the elevated head table. The terrified wedding DJ practically tripped over his own cable cords, scrambling out of her way. Sloane pulled a small encrypted flash drive from her tailored pocket, plugged it directly into the master console, and bypassed the estate security firewalls in seconds. High above the head table, two massive projection screens had been playing a continuous looping slideshow of Jamal and Brittany looking deeply in love on various expensive vacations. Those romantic images abruptly vanished. The screens flickered black for a fraction of a second before roaring back to life with a blinding white light. Instead of smiling couple portraits, the screens now displayed 50-foot-wide high-definition scans of Vanguard Properties' internal banking ledgers. The sheer scale of the projection made the financial data impossible to ignore. Every single fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, and every offshore routing number was magnified for the entire ballroom to see. I turned back to face the sea of horrified guests, using the glowing screens behind me as the ultimate backdrop of corporate execution. I gripped the microphone and raised my voice over the rising murmur of the crowd. I stated that the data currently illuminated behind me represented undeniable proof of massive systemic financial crimes. I pointed to the left screen, highlighting a specific column of numbers painted in bright crimson. I told the wealthy investors in the room that Jamal had not only stolen their money, but he had actively falsified quarterly earnings reports to artificially inflate the value of his sinking company. I formally accused him of committing severe violations of the Securities and Exchange Commission regulations, commonly known as SEC violations. I explained that he had purposefully misled shareholders to secure additional funding, using their new capital to plug the holes created by his own massive felony embezzlement. The use of the words SEC violations and felony embezzlement acted like a lit match dropped into a powder keg. The grand ballroom erupted into absolute pandemonium. The murmurs instantly escalated into shouts of pure outrage. A silver-haired billionaire sitting at a front table threw his crystal champagne glass against the floor, shattering it into 100 pieces, and screamed that Vanguard had just secured a $50 million bridge loan from his private bank last week. He demanded to know exactly where his capital was. Other investors joined the chorus of fury, abandoning their expensive dinners to swarm the edge of the elevated platform. Wives of corporate executives were frantically dialing their defense attorneys on their cell phones. I glanced down at the VIP family table amidst the chaos. Richard had collapsed back into his chair, clutching his chest. His face was completely devoid of color as he realized the magnitude of the criminal enterprise he had so desperately tried to align himself with. Brenda was rocking back and forth, her hands clamped tightly over her ears, utterly unable to process the total destruction of her social climbing dreams. They had mocked me, belittled me, and tried to force me to give away my only real estate asset to a man who was about to spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Jamal completely lost his mind. He spun around, staring up at the massive projection screens illuminating his crimes. He scrambled backward, knocking over his expensive chair, and lunged toward the audio-visual podium. He screamed at Sloane to turn it off, but my assistant simply stepped in front of the console, resting her hand firmly on her holstered weapon. Jamal froze, terrified of the armed corporate litigator. He backed away, his hands shaking violently, and desperately scanned the room for the one man who had always bailed him out of trouble. He screamed for his father. He yelled for Winston to come up to the stage and fix this disaster. He begged his dad to tell everyone it was just a massive corporate misunderstanding. I brought the microphone back to my mouth and cut through his pathetic screaming. I informed Jamal that his father could not save him this time. I stated that Winston was fully aware of the SEC violations and the felony embezzlement because I had personally briefed him in his private library exactly 2 hours ago. I told the entire room that Winston had been given a strict deadline to produce a confession, and his time had officially expired. The crowd roared in anger, demanding justice as the empire finally crumbled. The crowd roared in anger, demanding justice as the empire finally crumbled. The sheer volume of their collective fury shook the crystal glasses on the tables. Amidst the deafening noise of outraged investors, a shrill, hysterical scream pierced the air. It was my mother. Brenda was standing on her chair at the VIP table, wildly waving her arms and pointing directly at me. She shrieked for the estate security team to intervene, screaming that I was a deranged liar trying to destroy a sacred family union. Richard quickly joined her frantic display. He vaulted over the velvet rope separating their table from the dance floor and bellowed at the top of his lungs. He demanded the guards physically drag me out of the building aggressively, insisting that I had hacked the screens and falsified the financial logs out of pure, unadulterated spite. Their desperate performance temporarily emboldened the private security detail. 4 massive men in dark suits pushed their way through the angry mob of corporate executives. They completely ignored the furious investors and focused entirely on the elevated platform. They moved aggressively toward the stairs, fully intending to tackle me and confiscate the red-stamped forensic files. Sloane immediately shifted her stance, placing herself squarely between me and the advancing guards. She let her suit jacket fall open, making her holstered weapon explicitly visible, and raised one hand in a stark warning. The guards hesitated, but Richard continued to scream commands from the floor, pressuring them to act. The lead guard reached into his jacket, pulling out zip ties, preparing to rush the stage. Before a single guard could set foot on the first step, a voice thundered through the grand ballroom with the force of a detonating explosive. It commanded everyone to halt immediately. The command was so raw, so filled with absolute authority and agonizing despair, that the entire room froze. The security guards stopped dead in their tracks. The angry investors fell silent. Even my mother abruptly stopped her hysterical shrieking. Winston stepped out from the shadows near the catering kitchen. The billionaire real estate titan looked absolutely nothing like the confident tycoon who had hosted the country club dinner the night before. His face was a ghastly shade of gray. His custom tuxedo was heavily wrinkled, and sweat poured down his forehead. He walked slowly but with heavy, deliberate purpose down the center aisle, parting the sea of shocked guests. He did not look at the angry politicians. He did not look at my terrified parents. His bloodshot eyes were locked entirely on his son. Jamal saw his father approaching and let out a loud, pathetic gasp of relief. His narcissistic delusion was so deep that he genuinely believed Winston was marching up to the stage to save him. Jamal leaned over the edge of the platform, reaching his hands out toward his father. He frantically begged Winston to fix this disaster. He yelled that I was a psychotic corporate saboteur and pleaded with his dad to tell the investors that the offshore accounts were just a misunderstanding regarding legitimate tax shelters. Winston did not say a single word of comfort. He reached the platform and slowly climbed the short flight of stairs. He stood face to face with his son, panting heavily. Jamal offered a weak, trembling smile, waiting for his father to turn around and defend the Vanguard name. Instead, Winston planted his feet firmly on the stage. He drew his right arm back and struck Jamal across the face with every ounce of strength he had left in his failing body. The open-handed slap was devastating. The sickening crack of flesh hitting flesh echoed loudly through the microphone still resting near my hand. The sheer force of the blow snapped Jamal's head violently to the side and sent the massive chief operating officer stumbling backward. Jamal crashed heavily into the decorative floral archway, tearing down a cascade of white orchids as he fell to his knees on the wooden stage. A collective gasp sucked the remaining air out of the grand ballroom. Winston stood over his cowering son, his chest heaving. He reached out with a trembling hand and grabbed the microphone. He did not try to spin the narrative or mitigate the damage. He looked out at the furious investors, the terrified politicians, and my completely paralyzed parents. Winston spoke into the microphone, his voice gravelly and completely devoid of hope. He announced that every single word I had spoken was the absolute truth. He confessed to the entire room that Vanguard Properties was completely insolvent. He confirmed the massive $45 million embezzlement and publicly admitted that his own son had stolen the capital to fund his lavish lifestyle and this very wedding reception. He stated that the financial ledgers glowing on the massive projection screens were entirely accurate. Winston looked down at Jamal, who was sobbing pathetically on the floor, and declared that he had raised a thief and a fraud. He then turned his hollow gaze toward Richard and Brenda, who were now clinging to each other in sheer terror, and told them their precious golden ticket was nothing more than a federal criminal. The echo of Winston's devastating confession hung heavily in the air. He did not lower the microphone. Instead, he turned his back on my parents and faced the furious crowd of corporate investors. His voice shook with the weight of a man actively tearing his own heart out to save his remaining legacy. He announced that effective immediately, Jamal was terminated from his position as Chief Operating Officer of Vanguard Properties. He stated that he was fully cooperating with Apex Paradigm and the federal authorities to ensure every single stolen dollar was recovered. Jamal scrambled to his feet, blood trailing from his split lip. He grabbed his father's tuxedo sleeves, sobbing uncontrollably. He begged his dad not to do this, crying that they were blood and that he could fix the spreadsheets. Winston violently yanked his arm away, looking at his son with pure revulsion. He told Jamal that he had no son. He spoke into the microphone, his voice echoing across the silent ballroom, and formally declared that Jamal was entirely disowned. He announced that he was stripping Jamal of his trust fund, removing his name from the family inheritance and severing every single legal and financial tie between them. Winston stated that from this moment forward, Jamal was nothing more than a rogue criminal acting entirely independently of the Vanguard Corporation. The sheer brutality of the public disownment sent another intense shockwave through the room. Winston was ruthlessly amputating an infected limb to save the body, sacrificing his own flesh and blood to appease the institutional investors and dodge the incoming federal indictments. He looked directly at me and my assistant Sloane. He nodded slowly, a clear gesture of absolute surrender to the corporate executioner standing before him. Winston pulled his personal cell phone from his pocket. He did not bother walking off the stage. He dialed his primary wealth manager and the corporate banking liaison on speakerphone. He ordered them to comply fully with the emergency federal injunction Sloan had mentioned earlier. He formally authorized the immediate freezing of all accounts associated with Jamal, including his personal credit lines, his corporate expense accounts, and the emergency bridge loans currently funding this extravagant reception. The financial guillotine dropped instantly. The real-world consequences of the federal freeze hit the grand ballroom with terrifying speed. Less than 2 minutes after Winston ended his phone call, the heavy doors near the catering kitchen burst open. The general manager of the Vanguard Estate venue stormed into the room. He looked frantic, clutching a digital tablet. He bypassed the furious investors and marched straight to the elevated platform. He shouted over the murmuring crowd, announcing that the massive corporate card used to secure the venue rental and the catering services had just been flagged for federal fraud and completely frozen. The manager declared that all services were terminated immediately. He waved his hand aggressively toward the kitchen doors. As if on cue, the army of waiters in crisp white uniforms abruptly stopped circulating. They began taking silver platters of caviar and roasted quail away from the tables, completely ignoring the protests of the wealthy guests. The bartenders at the massive ice-carved open bar immediately pulled the metal grills down and locked the liquor cabinets. The string quartet, realizing they would not be paid quietly, packed their instruments into their velvet cases and walked out the side exit. Brittany let out a loud, piercing wail. A venue coordinator approached the VIP table and demanded that she vacate the luxury bridal suite immediately because the massive security deposit had just been officially clawed back by the bank. Brittany grabbed the edge of her custom silk dress, sobbing hysterically as she realized she was wearing stolen property. Brenda and Richard scrambled away from their table, rushing toward the stage. Richard grabbed Winston by the arm, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He yelled that Vanguard had promised to cover the $2 million reception. He demanded Winston write a personal check to the venue manager right now, screaming that our family could not afford to take on this massive debt. Winston shoved my father away with a look of utter disgust. He told Richard that he was currently facing a $300 million corporate bankruptcy and a federal investigation. He bluntly informed my father that paying for his stolen wedding was the absolute least of his concerns. Brenda collapsed onto the wooden steps of the stage, weeping loudly. The illusion of their elite status was entirely dismantled. They were not American royalty. They were just suburban social climbers left holding the bag for a spectacular fraud. I stood silently near the audio-visual podium, watching my family hit rock bottom. In the distance, the flashing lights of federal vehicles reflected against the glass. The red and blue strobes painted the ballroom in a harsh, chaotic rhythm, washing out the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers. The sheer speed of the federal response proved the severity of the evidence Sloan had forwarded. Before the remaining guests could even process the reality of the frozen bank accounts, the heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance burst open. They were pushed wide by a dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the letters FBI emblazoned across their backs. The lead agent, a tall man with a thick silver mustache, marched directly down the center aisle. Heavily armed officers immediately fanned out to secure all exits. The remaining corporate investors, who had been screaming for their money just moments before, instantly fell silent and scrambled out of the way. The luxurious wedding reception had officially transitioned into an active crime scene. Jamal watched the agents approach the elevated platform. His arrogant swagger was completely gone, replaced by the instinctual terror of a trapped animal. He scrambled backward across the wooden stage, slipping on the crushed white orchids. He backed into the floral archway, his custom tuxedo now stained with dirt. He looked frantically at his father, but Winston had already turned his back, staring blankly at the floor, offering absolutely no protection. The lead agent ascended the stairs with heavy, deliberate footsteps. He pulled a warrant from his jacket pocket and addressed Jamal by his full legal name. His voice was completely devoid of sympathy. He formally announced that Jamal was being placed under federal arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, felony embezzlement, and severe violations of the Securities and Exchange Act. Jamal shook his head violently, holding his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. He cried out that it was a mistake, stammering that he was the chief operating officer and had the capital to fix the discrepancies. The agent ignored his pathetic excuses. He grabbed Jamal by the shoulder of his tuxedo, spun him around, and forced his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly through the ballroom. It was the definitive sound of an empire collapsing. Brittany watched her new husband being manhandled by federal agents. The delicate illusion of her perfect fairy tale shattered into a million jagged pieces. She let out an agonizing scream, gathering the heavy layers of her silk wedding dress to run toward the stage. Two agents stepped in her path to block her advance. They sternly warned her to stay back and not interfere with an active federal arrest. Brittany collapsed to her knees on the stained dance floor. Her expensive designer veil slipped off her head, tangling in the spilled champagne and crushed flowers. She looked at Jamal, who was now being frog-marched down the stairs, his head bowed in absolute disgrace. He did not even look at her as he was dragged past her. He was entirely consumed by his own ruin. My sister then turned her furious, tear-streaked face toward me. Her makeup was ruined, running down her cheeks in dark streaks. She pointed a trembling finger at me, screaming at the top of her lungs. She accused me of destroying her life out of pure jealousy. She wailed that this was supposed to be her perfect day, her moment to shine, and that I was an absolute monster for taking it away from her. She demanded the federal agents arrest me instead, screaming that I was the one who had hacked the bank accounts and framed her innocent husband. The lead agent paused near the podium and looked at Brittany with profound exhaustion. He clearly dealt with delusional accomplices daily. He firmly told her to lower her voice before she found herself charged with obstruction of justice. He then turned to Sloan, who smoothly handed him the physical copy of the red-stamped forensic file. The agent nodded his thanks, officially taking possession of the evidence that would send Jamal to prison for decades. Richard frantically rushed toward the agents, his hands raised defensively, attempting to distance himself from the groom. He loudly declared that our family had no knowledge of the financial crimes. He swore that we were innocent victims who had been manipulated by the Vanguard family. He begged the agents not to freeze his personal bank accounts, claiming he was already deeply in debt from the venue deposits. The agent ignored my father entirely, signaling his team to begin cordoning off the elevated head table with bright yellow crime scene tape. The perfect wedding was completely dead. The perfect wedding was completely dead. The grand ballroom, once a shimmering testament to false wealth, was now a chaotic arena of flashing federal lights, furious corporate investors, and shattered illusions. The air tasted metallic, sharp with adrenaline and fear. Through the yellow crime scene tape currently being unspooled across the elevated head table, I watched the absolute psychological collapse of my parents. Richard slowly stood up from the wooden stairs where Brenda was still weeping. He looked like a man who had just survived a horrific car crash, only to realize he was the one who drove the vehicle into the wall. His gaze drifted from the sobbing figure of his favorite daughter to the handcuffed groom being escorted out the back doors, and finally settled on me. I was still standing near the audio-visual podium, perfectly composed, watching the destruction of Vanguard properties with the clinical detachment of a corporate surgeon. He staggered toward me, his footsteps heavy and uneven on the stained dance floor. He bypassed the angry investors arguing with the federal agents. He stopped a few feet away, seemingly terrified to get too close. The aggressive authority he had wielded in my hotel room just hours ago was entirely evaporated. He looked at my tailored suit, the heavy black card I had used to pay the florist, and the imposing presence of Sloan standing by my side. The massive projection screens behind me were still glowing with the financial ledger's undeniable proof of my firm's immense power. He swallowed hard, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. He asked me if I really owned the debt. He asked if I was really the chief executive officer of the company that just bought the entire Vanguard portfolio. I did not answer him immediately. I let him sit in the agonizing realization of his own catastrophic mistake. I let him replay the decades of emotional abuse, the constant belittling of my career, the forced payment of their extravagant bills, and the sheer audacity of demanding I sign over my only inherited property to appease a criminal. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I did not just buy the debt. I explained that I orchestrated the entire hostile takeover. I informed him that my firm, Apex Paradigm, controlled billions of dollars in assets. I stated clearly that the daughter he had consistently labeled a miserable failure, the daughter he had banished to a folding chair by the kitchen doors, was currently holding the absolute power of life and death over every corporate entity in this room. Brenda, who had crawled off the stairs and dragged herself across the dance floor, grabbed the hem of my trousers. Her face was smeared with expensive makeup and genuine terror. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with the horrifying understanding that she had spent her entire life worshipping the illusion of wealth while actively abusing the only true billionaire in the family. She choked on her own tears, begging me to help them. She sobbed that they were bankrupt, that the wedding loans were entirely in their name, and that without Jamal's money, they would lose their house by the end of the month. She desperately tried to invoke the family bond she had weaponized against me for decades. She cried that I was their daughter and that I had to save them from this disaster. I looked down at the woman who had slapped me just hours ago for daring to step into a VIP area. I felt absolutely nothing for her. The familial bond she was desperately trying to invoke had been severed a long time ago, cut by 1,000 careless insults and a lifetime of toxic favoritism. I told her the family bond she was relying on was entirely bankrupt, just like her bank accounts. Before my mother could continue her pathetic groveling, Brittany pushed past her. My sister looked like a deranged ghost of a bride. Her custom silk dress was stained with dirt from the stage and soaked with spilled champagne. Her mascara was smeared into dark, hollow circles around her eyes. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my blazer. She completely ignored the fact that her new husband was currently sitting in the back of a federal vehicle. Instead, her fractured mind clung desperately to the aesthetics of her ruined day. She aggressively demanded that I pull out my black card. She sobbed hysterically, commanding me to pay the furious venue manager and the caterers right now so the reception could continue. She wailed that she had planned this exact aesthetic for an entire year, and that my newly revealed billions could easily fix the floral arrangements and bring the string quartet back. Her absolute disconnect from reality was genuinely staggering. Richard shoved Brittany aside, his eyes wild with a different kind of desperation. He grabbed my shoulders, shaking me slightly. He told me the party was dead, but the Vanguard connection was not. His voice dropped to a frantic, manic whisper. He reminded me of the manila envelope he had ambushed me with at the hotel this morning. He begged me to hand over the deed to Aunt Beatrice's $600,000 house immediately. He reasoned with twisted logic that if we liquidated my property, we could post Jamal's massive federal bail. He genuinely believed that if we bought Jamal's freedom, Winston would forgive us. The criminal charges would miraculously disappear, and the Vanguard Empire would somehow resume funding their lavish lifestyle. He was fully prepared to sacrifice my only inheritance to bail out a man who had defrauded investors and lied to our entire family. I stepped back smoothly, forcing Richard to drop his hands from my shoulders. I looked at the three of them. They were a pathetic portrait of greed and delusion united only by their insatiable desire to exploit me. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled out the crisp manila envelope Richard had thrown at me just hours earlier. Richard's eyes lit up with a sickening glimmer of hope. He held out his trembling hands, fully expecting me to surrender my financial security to save his sinking ship. I did not hand it to him. I removed the legal quitclaim deed from the envelope. I held the thick parchment paper up, ensuring they all had a clear view of the document that was supposed to purchase their elite status. Without breaking eye contact with my father, I gripped the top edge of the paper and tore it straight down the middle. Richard let out a strangled gasp. Brenda shrieked in horror. I stacked the torn halves and ripped them again, completely destroying the legally binding document. The crisp sound of tearing paper cut through the surrounding chaos of the ballroom. I tore the pieces smaller and smaller until they were nothing but worthless scraps. I opened my hands and let the shredded remnants flutter down, watching them land softly in the puddles of spilled champagne and across my mother's expensive shoes. I looked at my family, my voice a perfect reflection of the ice running through my veins. I told them their bailout was officially denied. I advised Richard to start looking for a highly skilled bankruptcy attorney, and I told Brittany to get comfortable with the reality of handing her stolen silk dress over to the federal evidence locker. Richard stared at the shredded confetti resting on his wife's shoes, his jaw slacking in total disbelief. He stammered that I was insane, claiming I had just destroyed $600,000 of perfectly good real estate out of pure spite. I offered him a sharp, pitying smile. I calmly informed him he was mourning over a completely worthless piece of paper. I revealed that I had quietly sold Aunt Beatrice's suburban house to a commercial development syndicate nearly 8 months ago. The property had already been rezoned, bulldozed, and flipped for 3 times its original value. I explained that the document I just tore to pieces was nothing more than an outdated photocopy I kept in my archives. They never even had a fraction of a chance to touch that money. Brenda let out a hollow, defeated gasp. Brittany was entirely paralyzed, her tear-streaked face frozen in absolute shock. I looked at the three of them one last time, feeling the heavy chains of familial obligation finally snap. I told them this was the absolute end of our parasitic relationship. I stated firmly that I would no longer fund their ridiculous social delusions, cover their catastrophic credit card debts, or serve as the convenient scapegoat for their miserable failures. They had so desperately wanted to climb the elite social ladder. Now they were going to experience the brutal fall completely unassisted. I stepped gracefully around my kneeling mother and my shattered father. I gave a brief approving nod to Sloane, who immediately fell into step right beside me. We walked together through the remaining wreckage of the grand ballroom. Federal agents were actively taping off the champagne towers and tagging the massive floral centerpieces as evidence of wire fraud. Furious investors were still shouting at the venue managers, demanding capital that no longer existed. I moved through the heavy mahogany doors, leaving the suffocating, toxic atmosphere of the Vanguard estate entirely behind me. The crisp evening air hit my face the moment I stepped outside. The sprawling cobblestone driveway was a chaotic sea of flashing federal cruisers, panicked valets, and weeping guests waiting for their rides. A sleek, armored black SUV idled smoothly near the central fountain, standing out sharply against the disorder. My private security driver immediately stepped forward, pulling open the heavy, reinforced rear door. I climbed into the quiet, temperature-controlled cabin, the thick glass instantly sealing away the noise of my sister's ruined fairy tale. I settled into the plush leather seat and pulled my encrypted smartphone from my blazer pocket. The glowing screen illuminated my calm, unwavering expression in the dark cabin. I opened the highly secured executive messaging channel. I typed a final, definitive command to my financial acquisitions team. I instructed them to immediately execute the hostile takeover protocols for Vanguard properties. I ordered them to sweep up all remaining physical real estate assets for pennies on the dollar and initiate the total corporate liquidation process at dawn. I locked the screen, leaned my head back against the headrest, and instructed my driver to take me back to the city. The illusion was dead, and the empire was finally mine. The spectacular downfall of the Vanguard Empire and Caroline's family teaches a brutal but necessary lesson. The illusion of success is incredibly fragile when built on deception. While her parents sacrificed their morality and financial security for the mere appearance of elite status, Caroline cultivated quiet, undeniable power through hard data and competence. True strength doesn't need to shout for validation or mock others to feel significant. It operates in the reality of facts, ready to withstand the inevitable collapse of those who build their lives on lies. Evaluate your own priorities today and invest your energy into building authentic substance rather than chasing hollow prestige. It was an absolute thrill bringing this corporate takedown to its devastating conclusion. The stark contrast between Caroline's cold, calculated efficiency and her family's desperate, hysterical delusions made for a spectacular finale. The narrative perfectly highlights how quickly a house of cards collapses when confronted by someone holding the receipts.